Happy Reformation Day, believers. This is Nate Pickowicz. I'm coming to you to wish you a happy Reformation Day. As you know, the day in 1517 where Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Wittenberg and began the Protestant Reformation. But there's another special Reformation Day or Reformation time in our nation's history, which is the Great Awakening. Now this started in Northampton, Massachusetts, with the preaching of Jonathan Edwards. And I'm actually standing in front of the church in Northampton. This is Jonathan Edwards Church. Now this church this is not the original church. This is actually the fifth church to be in this spot. Edwards Church was replaced in 1812 by what was called the Old Church. The Old Church burnt down in 1876, and then this building was built in 1877 in its place. Now, this is the place where the Great Awakening began. And for a lot of people, they don't know that the Great Awakening actually wasn't one big event, but it was actually a series of two movements. The first beginning in 1734 and into 1735, where Jonathan Edwards was preaching to people in this town. There's about 1,000 people in this town at the time, and he began to preach to the people for conversion. It wasn't just a thing to have people come and sit in your church and be unconverted. He wanted people to be saved and understand the gospel, what we would understand the gospel of salvation by grace through faith. So Edwards began to preach in this spot, and it's believed in the first 6 months of the awakening, 300 people in this town came to Christ. It was actually the vast majority of the adults in the town. And so the awakening began right here in this spot, and kind of started to go. There was a series of revivals and awakenings, and it spread to several other dozen towns in the western Massachusetts area. Now this awakening, Edwards started to write about this and send a letter overseas, and the letter got as far as Isaac Watts, the famous hymn writer. The Wesleys read this letter, and George Whitefield read this letter that Jonathan Edwards wrote about what was happening in his hometown of Northampton, Massachusetts. And that began to drum up some interest, and Whitefield himself came over to the States after that letter was sent over from Edwards and began to preach up and down the East Coast. And so from 1740 to 1742 is what we think of as the Great Awakening. Big, huge revival and just amazing things happening. Edwards actually preached his most famous sermon, not here, but down in Enfield, Connecticut, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, in 1741. But this is where it all began. It did not begin in big, huge, large revival movements and huge cities and things like that. The Great Awakening in this country began in a small town in the western part, off the beaten path, by a faithful pastor. He began to preach the Word of God, and people were responding to God, and God began to move in people and convert them and change them and bring them to holiness. So I'm really thankful to be here. This church right here is now a United Church of Christ, a UCC church, a liberal church. In fact, this is the kind of church that Edwards would have preached against 250 years ago. And so we're back to where we were. We're back to the beginning, where people are starting to wander away from God. And even now in this town, there are unbelievers, and there's all kinds of stuff going on. This is a very liberal culture. New England is a liberal culture. We've rejected the things of God. And so my hope, my prayer is that there will be another awakening, another revival in this region, preaching of the Word of God, the hearing of the Word of God, that God might do something great again where we are. So it's cool to be here to check out this spot. This is where it all began for us over here. So anyway, hope you're doing well on this Reformation Day. I'm praying for New England and praying for all of you. God bless.